Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm going to call this meeting to order. This is a meeting on the Subcommittee on Public Safety. And before we get started with anything else, we'll go ahead and do roll call.
Here.
Detective Garber.
Hey, sorry you were breaking up. Detective Garber here with Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department.
Executive Director Hughes.
Here.
Assemblyman Roberts.
Here.
Director Tagliati.
Here.
And Chair Yeager.
I am here. Thank you for doing roll call. So we have everybody present. That means we do have a quorum. And we will now go to agenda item number 1, which is public comment. And so we'll start here in the room in Las Vegas. Is there anyone who'd like to give public comment? If so, you just want to come up to the table where it says public comment, and you'll have a couple minutes to provide that comment. I don't see anyone rushing up for public comment here. I don't believe we have any public comment on Zoom. I think we just have committee members and presenters, but if I'm wrong about that, if you're on Zoom and like to give public comment, if you could simply speak up, we'll allow you to do that. Okay. Never mind. No public comment via Zoom. So we do not have any public comment. We will close agenda item number 1, public comment. There will be another public comment opportunity at the end of the agenda. That takes us to agenda item number 2, which is the meeting minutes. Approval of the meeting minutes, and committee members, you should have received those. If you're here in Las Vegas, you have them printed in front of you, and I think we received them by email as well. I wanted to take a motion for each one because I did have a couple of corrections on them that I saw when I was looking through. So if we could start with the August 5th, 2021 committee meeting minutes, the couple of suggestions that I had for changes under the very first public comment. The individual is listed as Andre Muir. I think the spelling of his name is actually a little bit different, and thankfully at the very end of this agenda, or the very end of these minutes, we also have him giving public comments the second time period, and I think the spelling of his name is correct the second time listed on the agenda, which is on the very last page, 8 of 8. So I would just ask that we correct the spelling of his name. And then one more quick correction I had on page 2. The third paragraph down, I think when I was introducing myself, there's a reference to Assembly Bill 342, and that should just be 341, which was the consumption lounge bill. So just wanted to make sure we made that correction in case anyone was curious which bill was the consumption lounge bill. Any other corrections on the August 5th, 2021 minutes from any of our subcommittee members?
This is Detective Garber. Just one thing, they listed me as Commissioner Garber. Well, I appreciate the promotion, but my title should be detective.
Great, we'll make that change as well. I see that's on page 1 in the introductory comments. Okay, if there aren't any other corrections, I would take a motion to approve the August 25th, 2021 minutes. Do I have a second?
Yes, sir.
Okay, we have a motion from Assemblyman Roberts, a second from Director Tagliati. Any discussion on the motion?
Since I wasn't present for that meeting, I think I need to abstain from voting on the minutes.
Great, thank you. So from Executive Director Hughes will be abstaining because she was not present at that meeting. We do have a motion and a second. So all those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
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 All right, we have 4 motions to approve, 1 abstention. So that motion does carry. The August 25th, 2021 minutes are approved. Let's move next to the September 24th, 2021 minutes. I just had one really minor correction on these minutes, and it would be on the very last page under public comment. The first individual who provided public comment, we just misspelled her last name. It should be Buffong, Boffong. So we just need to add a G in the last name, and that was all I saw on those minutes. Any other corrections from subcommittee members for the September 24th, 2021 minutes? Okay, I don't hear anyone else. I would take a motion to approve.
I'll make a motion to approve with the changes that you indicated.
Second. I have a motion from Assemblyman Roberts, a second from Director Tagliati. Any discussion on the motion? Okay, hearing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
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 Okay, I heard 5 ayes. That means the motion passes unanimously. The September 24th, 2021 minutes are approved with noted correction. Our third set of minutes is the October 20th, 2021 minutes. I did not see any corrections needed for these particular minutes. Anything from subcommittee members? Okay, hearing none, I would take a motion to approve.
Make a motion to approve. Second.
We have a motion from Assemblyman Roberts, a second from Director Tagliati. Any discussion on the motion? Okay, all those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
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 I guess I should say anyone opposed, but I heard 5 ayes right there. So motion does carry unanimously. The October 12th, 2021 minutes are approved. That takes us through agenda item number 2. And we will now move to agenda item number 3, which is review of the petition filed pursuant to NRS 678A.461D. Sala Consulting on behalf of RNBW petition to amend various cannabis regulations as requested by the Cannabis Advisory Commission. So at this time, I'll invite Mr. Anderson up to the table and committee members, just so we kind of have a lay of the land in terms of what we're doing. We're going to have Mr. Anderson present the petition. You do have a copy of the petition in front of you. And when I say petition, it's really proposed regulations. Mr. Anderson will present that. We'll have a chance to ask questions and answers. And as you can see on the agenda, we'll hear from 1 or 2 other experts after that. And then we'll have an opportunity internally to discuss anything we might want in terms of recommendations to make to the larger Cannabis Advisory Commission. So with that, Mr. Anderson, thank you for joining us this morning, and we'll give you a chance to go ahead and present. I'm sure we'll have some questions.
Thank you for having me. Chris Anderson with Sala Consulting on behalf of RNBW for the record. Mr. Chair, would it be helpful for me to go through each regulation section or just the highlights, the overall highlights of these regulations add?
Mr. Anderson, I think it would be helpful if you wouldn't mind just kind of going through each section. I don't think it'll take too terribly long, and perhaps for purpose of this subcommittee, we're the public safety subcommittee. So if there are issues in the regulations that touch particularly on public safety, either in the text or in your mind, if you could maybe highlight those for us as well.
Sure. Okay. Chris Anderson again for the record. So this pilot proposal is intended to be a limited trial for the state to allow cannabis sales and consumption at private events. I'm sure you're aware there's an issue today where a lot of events are seeing cannabis consumption on their premises, and there's no way to legally allow or have taxable product at the event. So we're trying to, this proposal aims to alleviate that issue that exists in the market today. In terms of the details of the petition, on NCCR 1, the petition adds definitions for event owner, temporary cannabis event permit, and temporary cannabis event. Those are just more housekeeping definitions. Unless anyone has any questions about those the definitions added to NCCR 1, I will move on to NCCR 4, where we have added violations for offenses by temporary cannabis event permittees. So we've just carried over violations that exist for other cannabis establishment types and applied those evenly to temporary cannabis event permittees. Moving on to NCCR 5, we've modified the inspection protocol for temporary events. Inspections, as they're envisioned in the regulations today, are specifically for bricks and mortar settings and don't really allow for, a little bit of transient dynamic setup. So there's a little bit of a clarification to make inspections doable for events. And then importantly, NCCR 5 enumerates the application requirements to become a temporary cannabis event permittee. Temporary cannabis event permit is a one-time, non-transferable permit issued to the board by the board to a cannabis sales facility, which authorizes cannabis sales and consumption in designated areas. Temporary cannabis event permit applications are due to be completed and submitted by participating retail licensees who have entered into a contract with the event promotion entity, also defined as the event owner under these regulations. Event owners must receive and provide proof of permission from a local jurisdiction. So we're not taking any of the zoning or local prerogative away from those local jurisdictions. Applicants for a temporary cannabis event permit must not have a deficiency, unpaid taxes, or any outstanding fees to the CCB. The application must be accompanied by an event diagram with enhanced detail of the cannabis sales and consumption spaces. It must include the address and all of the normal location restrictions that apply to cannabis consumption lounges or dispensaries, any other establishment type apply. So those location restrictions vis-a-vis community uses and gaming, those are all still in place for a temporary cannabis event. The application requires a minimum of 25,000 people for daily attendance of the event. And this is kind of based on the principle that we're kind of going small by going large. So we're limiting this pilot opportunity to larger events that have the wherewithal and resources to conduct a compliant event. And that high minimum attendee number also kind of shrinks the Venn diagram of which events might qualify for this. So it's not too much for the board to take on all at once. The application, the permit can only be issued for a maximum duration of 5 consecutive days. I know someone made a comment about Burning Man at the CAC meeting. So open to conversation there, but as you mentioned, Chair Yeager, Burning Man probably wouldn't qualify for cannabis at the event for other reasons. So we can have more discussion on that if the subcommittee sees fit. Temporary cannabis events must prohibit firearms and other weapons. They must maintain on-site emergency medical responders, which is not required for any other cannabis establishment that I'm aware of. So for this group in particular, that requirement to maintain on-site emergency services is significant. And this is limited to outdoor events only. And that's so that some of those public health concerns with secondhand smoke and those types of things are more or less alleviated. Unless anyone has any questions about Regulation 5, I'll move on to 6. The petition proposes conforming changes to require events to comply with visitor procedures, training, standard operating procedures, and security. Regulation 9, we've made conforming changes to public health regulations, though that's some of the regulations that we carried over for consumption lounges from production. That's more or less for production licensees. So if you're making a ready to consume product, a food product, things like that, that's food safety. Moving on to Regulation 11, conforming changes to lab regulations so that those items apply to temporary cannabis events. Regulation 13, exception to delivery requirements to facilitate the agile response that's needed in an event setting for transferring product from a sales facility to the event and vice versa. And lastly, Regulation 16, there's a new section of regulations specifically for temporary cannabis events. Many of these regulations are carried over directly from the great work that this subcommittee did on consumption lounges. So I believe that every regulation you added for serving cannabis to the public for cannabis consumption lounges is also contained in this regulation. I'll just point out a couple of the highlights from Regulation 16. There's a wristbanding requirement to prohibit polysubstance use, and obviously an ID check requirement, just like there is for any other cannabis establishment. Pointing out that just like the regulations for cannabis consumption lounges, this would apply for single sale products only, and the per sale limits would also conform to consumption lounge regulations. And then lastly, it's reiterated that in the operations section that temporary cannabis events must maintain on-site emergency medical services. So that is a chapter by chapter summary of what's contained in the petition, and I'm happy to answer any questions the committee might have.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. A couple, really, I guess the first question I had, you mentioned larger events with an average attendance of 25,000. And just so we can kind of wrap our heads around that, what are some of the events that are that large that happen, particularly down here in Southern Nevada, that would meet that population threshold of being average attendance, but also being an outdoor event?
Right. So you'd be looking at festivals like potentially Day in Vegas, which is outdoor. That's close to some gaming uses, but that would be one. Life is Beautiful in the downtown area. And I think there's another large festival that happens on those same grounds. I'm forgetting the name offhand, but I know that there's another one that uses, I think, that same site. EDC or anything at the Las Vegas Motor Speedway would be a good candidate if they had at least that amount of attendance. And that attendance is possible at the Speedway. Also, potentially something at Allegiant Stadium if the stadium authority were to, at some point, allow cannabis events. So that gives you kind of a flavor of what might qualify. Yeah, I could also envision something potentially down maybe in the South Point area. I'm trying to think of any large events that are down there today. But I can envision a use somewhere down kind of in that area south of town.
Great. Other questions?
So Allegiant Stadium is considered an outdoor event?
That would be the board. I think the board would have to make a final determination. Wait, does the roof open? Or
just one side open.
Just one side opens. Okay. Well, that would be, I guess that might be a stretch then.
Yeah.
And obviously that would be up to Clark County and the stadium authority and,
And what would your, another question. So what would one of these event areas look like, right? So let's say you take Life is Beautiful, for instance, or EDC. I can picture, I've worked both of those events, special events. So how would it look like? Where would the consumption area be? And, kind of give me an idea of what that would look like.
Yeah, in my mind, so they would look, the event as a whole would look a lot like it does today, except for that within the event premises, probably well past the area where you enter the event, there would be kind of pop-up areas, designated areas that the board must approve. So they look at the layout and decide whether or not this pop-up area is a good location for cannabis sales and consumption. So the sales and consumption would all stay in that designated area. Of course, we all know these events today, there's people, some of these events you can't walk 10 feet without smelling, cannabis burning. So, not going to say that any permittee could ever stop any consumption outside of the designated sales and consumption area, but at least we would be providing a legal, safe area for legal product and for consumers, whether they're residents or tourists, to consume legally. So yeah, it would look like a pop-up area, like any other, like a food stand or something, but you'd have security around it. The perimeter would be controlled. It'd be access control. There'd be one point of entry, just like a dispensary or a consumption lounge. So we'd be controlling for obviously age verification at each access point. And then again at the point of sale. So it would look a lot like, maybe a small consumption lounge counter might look like, but within an event and with that secure perimeter.
And you would envision maybe multiple locations within a large, like say Life is Beautiful is pretty good sized footprint. So you would envision multiple locations within the event.
Yeah, I would, for an event of that magnitude and for, anything probably with 25,000 people or more, I would envision probably multiple. Again, it would be up to the board to approve a proposed layout and how many, spots you're going to have and where they're going to be for sales and consumption. But, I would expect that everyone, the board included, would want to make sure that there's enough legal area there and product to service everyone at the event, just again, to enhance that reduction in illicit drug use.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Tagliato, any questions?
Just the last part of it, you said you hope to reduce the illegal by having it legal, having the retailers, correct?
That's right.
And you're going to leave it to the board as far as the number of locations within any particular event.
Right. The board, as a provision of the application section, the board has the ability to approve or deny or ask a permittee applicant to modify the layout if it doesn't meet the board's.
How would you recommend the retailers be selected?
So the retailers have to, just like, well, not just, but I'll put it this way. So with consumption lounges, we had independent consumption lounge licensees. Once they're issued those licenses, they have to contract with a sales facility, an existing dispensary, to source their product. And for a temporary cannabis event, so let's say it's Life is Beautiful. Life is Beautiful is not, a licensed cannabis retailer in this state. So they have to partner with a dispensary that's already existing. And it's the licensee who's, kind of on the line for the compliance and, so their license is
I'm trying to clarify who would pick, if we have a dozen licensees and it's determined to only be 3 retail shops or booths or whatever. How do you determine?
So I don't think, I think that would probably be up to the event owner, the event promotion entity. So the event promotion entity or the event owner, they invite the dispensaries that they want to partner with to work at the event. And, assuming that, so I think you're maybe envisioning a scenario where Life is Beautiful wants to work with 5 dispensaries, but the board, will only approve 3. I think that would go back to the event owner to say, okay, well, these are the 3 then that we're going to work with.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions on Zoom? Detective Garber or Executive Director Hughes, anything you'd like to ask Mr. Anderson?
This is Detective Garber. I have a couple questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please go ahead.
And I apologize. I'm a little under the weather, so I'll try to get through this as best as possible. One of the first questions I had was, and I can't seem to find in any of the proposed changes, but there's nothing that says, since our regulations and NRS states that we can't have marijuana consumption and alcohol sales at the same event. I don't see anything that's being proposed where we're either having marijuana sales or we're having alcohol sales. Are you proposing that we have both at these events, which is a violation of the regulations and NRS? So
in these regulations, it points out that, that neither tobacco nor alcohol could be sold within the event within the event sales and consumption area. And, that's consistent with, the rules for dispensaries and consumption lounges. So the event as a whole, that's sort of a separate issue because the board isn't regulating, Life is Beautiful per se. They're regulating the sales and consumption area. They're regulating the temporary cannabis event, which is, again, if you think of it as sort of an event within an event, like a pop-up.
No, I get that. I guess my question is, how do we not allow people who have consumed alcohol to consume marijuana too? I think I've worked these events for the last 10 years and it's pretty much next to impossible to be able to regulate that. And I guess that would be a huge concern for law enforcement is how do we, say, oh, this person's been drinking, then they go smoke marijuana or they consume marijuana and then leave and go drink alcohol. How do we distinguish between the two?
Yeah, I think, for law enforcement, you're finally going to have the chance to actually distinguish between the two. Today, that's obviously happening at events because cannabis isn't being regulated at all. And so, cannabis obviously exists at, plenty of events that serve alcohol and it's not being regulated. There's no way to regulate it right now. The way that we envisioned regulating that in this petition is that when a guest enters the cannabis sales and consumption area, you're issued a wristband. And if you take that off, to say, go get a beer or something, you can't get a new one and come back and purchase cannabis again. So it at least, excludes people who we know have, been to, within the cannabis area and then going and, taking off the wristband for whatever reason, and then coming back in and trying to use cannabis.
Okay. And I have one other question, maybe two more. You did say that this was a pilot program. What do you envision as being the pilot? How long is it? How many events?
There's not a limitation, a numerical limitation on the number of events. I think, when you get into that, it presents some unique challenges for the Cannabis Compliance Board. We've seen that in other limited license application rounds, things like that, where it leads to a lot of, leads to a litigious atmosphere. And so I think, this pilot, is a pilot by virtue of its provisions. If you look at some of these requirements, there's just a very finite number of events that could qualify. So that's how we sort of made this more of a pilot concept. As far as a time limit, at the meeting of the full CAC, I heard Executive Director Klimas mention that, potentially trying this next year. Chair Yeager, I don't know if you remember something different than that in terms of a time period, but there's no time limit for this pilot to go on. I think it's just until everyone gets their feet wet, law enforcement, the board, all stakeholders can kind of get a sense for how this is going to work in a very limited way. And then, I think probably a logical next step would be to review lessons learned and in a highly, compliant atmosphere, review those lessons learned and potentially look at, making any number of changes to these regulations.
Thank you for that. And I just had one other question too. I know you had said that the Cannabis Board would be regulating the pop-up areas during these events. Would that mean that the Cannabis Board would be there full time? I know that they're very limited in the amount of personnel that they have currently. Would these vendors or these events allow local law enforcement to regulate them, even though that law is not being violated?
Yeah, I think that typically when you look at the events that I mentioned, they tend to welcome law enforcement. And there's, in fact, I see a lot of these events, contracting with, either off-duty law enforcement officers or, paying for overtime for law enforcement folks to be, on the grounds. So, I don't think that there's going to be an issue of, not allowing law enforcement to help patrol this environment. I think that's going to be a welcome presence. But, with your question about the board, I think the board would have, again, knowing that this is a pilot, knowing that we all want to learn from a very limited number of these events that may happen, I think the board probably will want to have a relatively significant presence, relative to, their current activities, enforcement activities, just to learn more about what's going on at the event and finding out any pain points that we see and making sure that the event remains compliant throughout.
Thank you.
Commissioner Hughes, did you have some questions?
I do. Really, I have a comment and a question, and it may not really relate to the public safety aspect, but for the Department of Taxation, we require that for temporary events that the business register and receive a temporary event permit from the Department of Taxation. So I don't know if you've taken that into consideration as well. That may be an extra step for these event operators. And then my only other question really is, how far in advance are you anticipating these application periods would be? Because it would take us some time if they have to come and get a temporary event permit from us.
Yeah. So in terms of the timing, I've seen in other states, I believe Michigan mandated that you submit a temporary cannabis event permit application 60 days before the proposed event would happen. I think California was either 60 or 90. So that's kind of the customary time period. But obviously, I think these events are of the magnitude where everyone involved would want to get pretty far ahead of the ball game. And if they were going to, these are events that can't really, can't efficiently change their layout on a dime. They plan their event layouts months and months ahead of time. And so I think everyone involved is going to have a stake in making sure that they get their application approved far ahead of time and that, they can use the layout that they're planning on. Not that it's not an issue at all, but I'm really glad you brought that up because, there does exist a numerical advance application provision in some other states. And, like I say, I think these events are really going to want to get ahead of the game. And we obviously want to give, as the state, not we, you probably want to give folks, an expectation of, how, within what time frame an application could be adjudicated. So that's something that I'll maybe look at adding. Maybe perhaps we could talk further about that.
Okay, thank you.
And then could I just ask, with the temporary event permit, some of those event operators that I just mentioned, I assume that they already apply for and receive the event permit that you referenced?
I believe so, yes. So, and then their individual vendors would also have to, if they are located in Nevada. If they're not located in Nevada, usually the event operator can apply for permits to allow for non-state vendors to appear at their events. But we do, for Nevada state businesses, we do require that they have an event specific permit.
Understood.
I have a few more questions I was thinking about, Mr. Anderson, so I'll just come back to a few of those. I'm just thinking about these events in general, and you take like a Life is Beautiful, and of course, if anyone's ever been there, there's a pretty significant security presence, and usually you see medical personnel. So, I mean, I'm assuming at events this large, I don't know where that requirement comes from, but there's already the requirement that they have to have security. And I guess my question for you perhaps is it the event organizer, owner, planner, promoter that contracts for that security, or is that provided by the state or the local government? Do you know how that typically works in these sort of events?
My understanding, just from, experience of seeing these larger events, is that, that security is, I don't know whether the state's providing, state or LVMPD is providing it and the event, owner is paying for it, or if the event owner is contracting for it and paying for it. But either way, the event owner is on the hook for those expenses.
What typically happens is, so any of these special events, it all goes through a permitting process that is submitted to the county or the city or wherever it's at. So Metro has visibility on it. So in this instance, let's say these are approved and they have a plot map with some of these consumption areas in there. If Metro doesn't like it, they have the ability to still weigh in on the footprint for the approval of the event. And so at those times, they determine security needs, private and public officer needs, like for CDC or EDC, we're heavily involved in those plannings. And so they would still have some oversight in it.
And then one other question I had, just thinking about cannabis as it stands right now, it's still largely a cash only industry. And I think about it seems like a lot of these events are trying to go cashless with other things, right? With food, with beverage, with merchandise. Obviously that, unless the federal government does something, that's not going to change when it comes to cannabis. So my thinking on it is, maybe there's more of a need within that area, or in terms of the vendor, the cannabis vendor having to, potentially have cash on hand to make change and then bring cash back from the event to their facility. But I guess I wondered, did you envision that the actual, I guess it's the retail cannabis establishments that's providing the product there, did you envision they would have their own security there as well, or would they be relying on the event planner, owner, promoter to provide that security?
So I didn't enumerate that in this petition. I think, I think the cannabis, sales facility and the event owner are going to be working so hand in glove in this situation that it kind of almost doesn't matter which one of them, contracts for that security. I think, retailers have demonstrated, I think, really good ability to secure their locations. And I think they're going to be looking to do that, obviously out, at an event, especially a large event.
And then just thinking about the separate consumption lounge area or consumption, I guess it's not a lounge, consumption area. My recollection from going to these events is they're outdoors, so there are plenty of people who are smoking cigarettes. And I think by and large, we don't tell them they can't do that. There are certain areas maybe where they're not allowed to. But so the way you envision this, I just want confirmation that it's sort of like extra protection and segregation on cannabis that would not be the case with like tobacco at these sort of events. Because my memory is people just walk around smoking cigars and cigarettes and a lot of other stuff too, right? Including cannabis as it is now. But so that consumption area you're envisioning would just be for cannabis. So we're not going to push other smokers or users of substances into that area.
Correct. Yeah, this is designated for cannabis sales and consumption only. And that just helps, again, with compliance. It helps kind of differentiate, okay, this is the compliant area. And if you're seeing this outside, then it's, it's not compliant.
Okay, I think the last question I had, I think about some of these events, take a Life is Beautiful. I've never been to EDC, so I can't comment on that. But they have set places where alcohol is being sold, for instance. But then at times I remember, there might be like mobile vendors, right? They have carts that they're pushing, and maybe they're serving alcohol, or you can purchase shots or whatever. What is your vision for the cannabis in these events? Is that going to be an option, that there's going to be mobile, or is it going to be strictly in the areas that are designated?
That's a great question. In this petition, cannabis sales is restricted to the designated sales and consumption area. I didn't necessarily think through that kind of like quote unquote mobile model for within that designated area. But, just sitting here thinking about it, my vision would be that we'd want it to be very much more set up like a consumption lounge or retail setting where someone had to go up to a counter, at least at the beginning for this trial, to go up to a counter, interface with someone who's trained to recognize polysubstance use, which this committee wisely regulated for cannabis consumption lounges, and we've carried on for this petition. But I think that that's important. So that might be something you want to look at.
Okay. And then did I generate any additional questions from subcommittee members?
I think we covered, the issue of the issue in the event, and that still would go through the normal process. So law enforcement still have an opportunity to review that there. The other thing is, I know, remembering when we talked about regulations for regular consumption lounge, there'd be no to go. They would have to consume it in the area. They couldn't take leftovers and take a doggy bag out or anything like that, right? And so that protection is still there, right? Yes. I think that was my only other question.
Yes, and we carried over that protection to this petition as well. Yeah, there were a lot of really good, particularly public safety minded regulations in those consumption lounge regulations that were passed this summer, and we carried those over. Really, as long as they applied to events, we endeavored to carry those over, just kind of word for word into this regulatory regime.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions from subcommittee members? Okay, go ahead.
One other. So I know, and I can't remember what finally passed on our recommendations, because I know we had asked for temporary shutdowns, the ability for law enforcement to do temporary shutdowns. And I don't know what finally got into the regulation there. I know we wanted 12 hours or 72 hours, but I don't know if we lost the ability at all to shut those down. My question would be, would that apply to this? So if we're at a special event and compliance officers aren't there, or they don't have a footprint there, and we see flagrant violations that are occurring in those, would we have the ability, meaning we as in law enforcement would have the ability to temporarily shut that down?
I believe you do, and if you don't, I'm happy to draft that in.
I see.
It's in there.
I apologize.
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
it's actually on the very last page,
Okay.
page 25, the second to last item. And so it carries over the closing for a period not to exceed 72 consecutive hours.
All right.
Given your 5 days.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. That was my last question.
So I think what I'd like to do, Mr. Anderson, I want to just ask if you don't mind to just stay at the table for now. And, we're still on item number 3, but I'd also like to, if I'm allowed to do this, open up agenda item number 4 at the same time. And, we'll hear from our presenter. And then I want to keep you here because we might have questions that are better suited to you. And then I think after that presentation, we'll make sure we don't have any additional questions for you as the petitioner before we get to a potential discussion of recommendations. So committee members, we had a couple of presenters scheduled. Unfortunately, one of our expert presenters was not able to join us. So Hazel Bagwell is not going to be presenting. I will tell the committee I had a discussion with her last week and kind of got her insight on some of her work in California on some of these events. And they've been much in line with what Mr. Anderson talked about in terms of things to consider when it comes to safety. But so I want to thank her for at least speaking to me. And unfortunately, she couldn't be here, but we do have Samin Ahmad, and you have her resume in front of you. If you want to take a look at that, we have her joining us by Zoom. And before I turn it over to her, I wanted to thank her as well for talking to me on Friday a little bit about some of her experience. And so I've asked her to, come forward today and just give us her insight on these events and any reaction to what she's heard so far this morning in terms of our discussion, any recommendations, best practices, or things not to do, and then we'll have a chance to ask questions. So thank you for joining us via Zoom, and we'll give you a chance to make whatever statements you'd like before we take questions.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, all of you, for allowing me to sit in. I've worked in the cannabis industry for over 8 years. One of the first people to pull licenses 1 through 7 in California, 1 through 4 in Michigan, did events previously in Colorado, Oklahoma, Rhode Island. So super excited to do things in Nevada. I actually work with Life is Beautiful. I also work with EDC. So not only do I have the cannabis side experience on that end, but also on the event side. So listening to a lot of your questions and comments makes a lot of sense to me. I know really what we've come to realize is that as cannabis legalization furthers, people want a place to consume, just like they want a beer garden to share beers. And so if we give them a safe place to do that, we can continue to maintain the legality and the officialness of this. And it's what we believe in when we gather people as well, is to have medical, to have safety, to have the support of law enforcement and city officials, to make it a better place. And so I'm very thankful that you guys are considering this opportunity. Further to that, I wanted to also share, it's really rewarding those people that follow the rules and follow the stipulations. So Chris had mentioned making sure that people are in good standing with their taxes and good standing with their permits and licensees. And that would apply not only to the promoter, but to the participants and the retailers that are joining us. And we've had opportunities, we want to make sure we give everyone a chance, but we want to also make sure that they follow those parameters. Do you guys have questions for me or any specific things I can elaborate on further?
Yeah, I guess just if you have any reaction or advice based on some of the questions that you heard and your experience in the industry, particularly, I think, things that work well, or maybe things that you tried at the beginning that didn't work so well, so we can avoid some of those.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about alcohol and cannabis consumption, because it's a big question. I appreciate that being mentioned. The reality is it's happening anyway. So why not create a system where it can happen in a safe manner, where there are taxes for that safety, and that the people that are participating in legal cannabis have a way to provide this opportunity or this product for people, and that where your cannabis is coming from. And so in California, they had originally just said no. It can't happen. So then events decided to just do events right next to each other. So one event was a beer garden and one event was a weed event, but the ABC wasn't talking to the Cannabis Commission, and it was pretty tough because there was no commonality. So you couldn't tell if somebody was overconsumed once they left the gates on the left side of the event to the right side of the event. So I think if we can work together and create a framework that puts people's safety first, like you guys have been doing with the social use lounges, it's going to be much more successful. So that was one big learning that we went through. Secondly, you guys had mentioned potentially vendors coming in from out of state. I know obviously, cannabis doesn't cross state lines and whatnot, but that is something that other people have tried to do and it's been unsuccessful. So I think making sure that that doesn't necessarily come into fruition is important at the current time period. And then just the other thing is just really pilot programs or watching the behavior, right? Like working together to see the successes and having an open communication of all the things that went well, things that need approval, and then putting that onus on the promoter. So if I was the one applying, put that on me. If you saw something that wasn't performing well, make it my responsibility to fix that or have a conversation about it.
Great, thank you for that. Any questions for Ms. Ahmad from subcommittee members?
As Detective Garber, I have a couple questions for her.
Please go ahead, Detective.
Thank you again for joining us. A couple questions. I know you had mentioned that You say that the cannabis use is being used already. Why not just allow it? I kind of have a problem with that on the law enforcement end, because we know that other drugs are being consumed at these events. We try to enforce it as best we can, but I just don't feel that just because it's happening, should we just allow it or give them a safe space? There's other drugs being consumed there, and we know that based off the medical tents and everything like that. I just don't see it making it a safe space for people just to use drugs.
I understand that, and that definitely was not my intention to be a blanket statement. It was that as you guys are working into the social use lounge, it just is a comment I was applying towards cannabis consumption.
I appreciate that. It's just, you see where I'm going with, we know it's happening. So do we just allow it to happen, or, be able to give them a safe space for doing that? And I did have one other question. I know you said that, have you had any problems with people drinking and consuming marijuana at any of these events in California? And if these events are happening, what events are there in California that they're allowing, they giving them the temporary special event to consume the marijuana?
Yeah, so for the most part, no issues. People that are typically consuming cannabis tend to consume more cannabis than alcohol. The mixture has not been an issue in the events that I have participated in. One of the largest ones that does have a cannabis garden at their festival is Outside Lands, which is held in San Francisco every summer with over 90,000 people attending. They have a very specific cannabis village that they've done for the past 3 years. The other events, High Times has put on some events in California where there have also been some beer gardens there. And there's more events applying and coming to fruition.
Excellent. Thank you. And one other question. I know you had said that, we keep the marijuana sales in state. Do you feel that as working with other events that these consumption lounges, or are they willing to put their licenses on the line to make sure that they're being regulated inside these special events?
Yes, absolutely. I think people are anxious to have the marketing and exposure opportunities outside of their brick and mortar.
All right. Thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you.
Well, and that might be a question too. So in California, if somebody's outside of their brick and mortar at one of these events and they do violate, or maybe you haven't seen any violations, but it would jeopardize their brick and mortar location license, correct? It wouldn't just be any punishment would just only be imposed on their temporary permit. Would it follow them back to the regular, the regular facility to have more skin in the game, for instance?
Yeah, so in California, there's one license. There's a couple of licenses you can hold to participate in an event. You could own a micro retailer license, a delivery license, or a retail license to actually sell the cannabis at the event. So yes, it would 100% lead back to them if they did have a violation. I have seen some violations, and I have worked with the state and those license holders on how to ensure those don't happen again. And a lot of that is about educating them, and things like that tend to happen the first round, and then they do not come back, or those folks do not come back to participate.
Thank you.
Other questions from subcommittee members? Right, I'm not hearing any additional questions. Thank you for joining us this morning on Zoom. We appreciate it. Appreciate the
Of course.
perspective.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, take care. And then I guess before we get to our next agenda item, did just want to ask why we still have Mr. Anderson here, if there were any additional questions before we relieve him from the hot seat.
Just a clarifying question, and maybe it's here and I just didn't quite consume it right. So to get a temporary license, they have to, is a sale licensee or existing licensee have to put up additional money, bond or anything like that, or they just apply for it because they're already established?
Yeah, they're already a licensed sales facility,
All right.
so they're required to show proof of liquid assets, just like you would have to do to apply for a consumption lounge license or a retail license.
So there's no additional requirements to apply for this license?
No, it's pretty much carried over.
Okay.
Again, I carried over from consumption lounges.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Anything else from subcommittee members? I don't hear anything, so Mr. Anderson, I think you are off the hook. Thank you for being here. I'll go ahead and close agenda item 3 and agenda item 4. And that takes us to agenda item 5, which really is the meat of today's meeting. And so what I wanted to do is just give us a chance as a subcommittee to discuss what we've heard. And then, really what I envision our role, I don't think our role is so much to opine on whether the advisory commission and ultimately the board should do this pilot program. I think our objective really is to provide some information related to public safety, that if this is going to go forward as a pilot, here are some things we think you need to think about and potentially include. Obviously, we have some recommendations. We have the petition that carries a lot of the recommendations from the consumption lounge regulations. But I think what our role is to say are the things that are missing that we should bring to the attention of the advisory commission for further discussion. What I've kind of heard so far, I've been taking some notes, and so I think these are some considerations, and certainly we will open it up for further discussion. But and some of these admittedly are already in the petition, but just to sort of emphasize them, I heard about, the need for separate spaces for consumption, separate sort of secure areas. And I think a question was raised as whether that would be one or more than one. And it sounded to me like probably that would be something that would be up to the board when looking at the particular event, whether there needs to be one or more than one. I do have some concerns that a very large event, if you only had one, and you have one point of entering and exiting. I think what we don't want to have is really crowd control issues happening in that one area. You think about a Life is Beautiful. They don't just have one bar or one place selling food. They have multiples. And I think part of that's probably for managing crowds and for traffic control. So I heard that. I heard, I think this was already in there, the regulations, but I think it's important, the need to provide free water and hydration for people in the consumption area. That is already in the proposed petition. We talked a little bit about mobile sales, and I think I sort of agree that we shouldn't be doing anything mobile as a pilot. It should look very much like a retail facility inside of the consumption space. The need for emergency medical and adequate security obviously is crucial. And then I think I also heard if these things get launched after one or two of these happen, it would be a good idea for either the Cannabis Advisory Commission or the board itself to reevaluate and think about, are there lessons learned? Can this program continue? But I think that kind of analysis really should happen after every one of these events in the pilot program to see what changes need to be made. So those were sort of the, I guess, 4 or 5 highlights that I took from the discussion, but certainly wanted to open it up to subcommittee members for discussion or for some additional recommendations about what we should report back to the Cannabis Advisory Commission. So who'd like to go first?
I'm not a member.
Okay.
I'm not a decision maker. Rosalie Bordelove for the record. I just thought I could give you one point that comes from my experience representing agencies governing professions. For these, the security for these events there's a large amount of private security, and a lot of it's coming from out of state, particularly California. I know that from representing the private investigator board who licenses the companies who bring in the security. Just noting that to the extent that your proposed rules that differ from California, whether or not you want any requirements regarding making sure that the security knows the rules and knows what needs to happen. It's just a thought I'd point out from my experience. I'm not a decision maker here.
No, so I mean, I think I'll add that on. Obviously, I think there's some in the petition, there's obviously some of the information brought in from consumption lodges relative to training of folks who are working to see the signs of overconsumption. But I think a training requirement for any security working these events to be versed in what the rules are with respect to cannabis, which, as you said, may be different in California and certainly are going to be different from the alcohol and other sites. So it's a good thought. Thank you. Go ahead.
I think my concern on this is just the timing of it. I mean, it is a pilot program, but our consumption lounge isn't aware of a pilot program. We have no idea how that's going to play out from a law enforcement perspective. And so it's kind of getting a little ahead of ourselves is what my concern would be for this, particularly in looking at it from the multiple drug use, comorbidity issues, and then with alcohol. From a Department of Public Safety point of view, we have, I'm aware of a lot of the illegal grow that goes on in California and up in northern Nevada. So that's an issue I worried about. We've got to be worried about quality control, et cetera, et cetera. So I am sensitive to the idea that if you're going to have it, you'd rather have some control over the product rather than illegal product coming onto the facility or the location. But at the same time, it's tough to justify, well, we're doing it anyway, to legalize something that's, well, maybe we should be controlling it more. So that's just some of my ideas up front.
Yeah, I think just in response to that, I think a lot of these events we're talking about have already happened. So these are events that I think are still months out, more summertime events and fall events. So it gives me some comfort that I believe the consumption lounge application period just closed on Friday, and I'm assuming there'll be some kind of release telling us how many people applied, but I think we'll have, I don't want to predict, but I believe we'll have consumption lounges up and running before we would ever get to the point, and I say we, before the board would ever get to the point where they would consider licensing these. And I guess kind of the way I see it is, the Cannabis Compliance Board could approve regulations allowing for these events, but it's still up to them whether to actually give the go-ahead and license somebody to do it. So I would certainly hope and expect that they would take into consideration, for example, if consumption lounges open up and there's all kinds of problems, which I'm crossing my fingers there's not going to be, that my guess is I would likely put the brakes on licensing any sort of outdoor events. But certainly your point is well taken. I think this is an area, much like consumption lounges, where we need to make sure we're getting it right. So we don't have something happens that, reflects poorly on the industry here, reflects poorly on the state and the board.
Yeah, I think it goes back to with Mr. Anderson's presentation. He said, part of it being a pilot program is that we would have lessons learned and we could modify. I'm just from, again, my perspective in law enforcement, I'm still waiting for the consumption lounges to get my lessons learned and to modify. And there we prohibit alcohol. I mean, we have certain rules that I think we can more control. So I think we're taking a quantum leap here. That's my opinion.
And so to be eligible to run these special events, right, you only have to be a sales facility, not a consumption lounge facility, correct?
Yeah.
Is that the way it's written?
I think that's the way
It's written so that only sales facilities can apply.
So, which this is something to consider is now now you've got somebody that isn't their normal. Well, probably most of the lounge facilities are going to be sales facilities anyway. I'm guessing there's probably not going to be very few that aren't already sales. But now you have people that are performing and doing something that they're normally not licensed to do, right? So it's like a special event. And I don't know if that's too restrictive or if what you were trying to do is maybe restrict these licenses in the pilot program to people that are already perform or have consumption lounges, because to what Director Tagliati is talking about is in the timing of this is more than likely they will be starting to open anyway before they would probably issue any of these. They would have some experience in this field rather than just all on their own, that might be something that they consider for the pilot. Otherwise, I think there's a lot of safeguards built into it, for special events. You have a review of the site plan anyway for security and health implications and things like that are separate from this. And so I think law enforcement would have the ability to review those as they normally do with anything. They'd have the ability to shut this specific event down if it got out of hand. I think those are some good off ramps for it. So I like that. I just don't know about allowing somebody that doesn't normally do it to do it.
How about on Zoom? Detective Garber?
You dropped off.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, still there.
Again, from our position with LVMPD, we strongly oppose allowing this to go forward with special events. Again, we just don't have the brick and mortar buildings up to have any sort of pilot program or anything to see what issues come up with that. I think that takes at least a couple years to determine, what works, what doesn't work. And, basically putting a cart before the horse with even considering these temporary permits. Basically, it's kind of irresponsible for us to even be considering this from our point of view. Again, with the alcohol and the marijuana and the polysubstance, it's going to be nearly impossible to try to regulate this. And we know what kind of issues we've had with the hookah lounges and the alcohol and the violence that comes along with that. And we just don't want those issues to happen at these large scale events.
Director Hughes, anything you'd like to add?
No, the only other thing maybe is just to emphasize giving enough time for approval of these applications, especially as others have mentioned, for review of the site plans. So maybe just making sure that's taken into consideration.
Great. Well, again, I don't think, let me put it this way. There's definitely some strong opinions about whether these sort of events should go forward. I didn't so much read our mandate as to make that determination. I think ultimately that'll be up to the Cannabis Compliance Board. And, they sent this out first to the Advisory Commission to consider it, and then to our subcommittees to bring up additional considerations. So, I guess I wouldn't be sort of as concerned. I don't think our role is to say we should or we shouldn't. Our role is to say, if you go forward, here's things that you need to think about and include in the regulations. And so, to carry out that mission, with the committee's consent, I guess what I would like to do is think about, perhaps communicating back to the Advisory Commission, who tasked us to do this work, to say that, look, there are definitely some concerns on this public safety subcommittee about when these things should be licensed, if they should be licensed, but realizing that it is something that's up to the Cannabis Compliance Board, that the topics we discussed today are things that should be considered by the commission and ultimately the board when it comes to polysubstance use, when it comes to separate areas for consumption, when it comes to security and emergency medical, when it comes to ideally learning some lessons from consumption lounges before any of these would be licensed, when it comes to whether do you include a requirement that someone actually operate a consumption lounge before they could be licensed to do that. I'm not sure, but I think these are all things that should be taken into consideration by the commission and ultimately the board. So I don't know if we have to take a motion for that, or if we can just, simply, I'd sort of leave it to our council.
I guess I would just say, to the extent that you want to be forwarding specific, recommendations of look at these things, that would require a motion to the extent you're forwarding stuff to the commission. But to the extent that you're deciding you want to talk about this more later or those kinds of things, that doesn't require much.
Okay. I don't know. Any committee have a preference on how we want to proceed?
Well, I think we've got a pretty good list of things to take into consideration that we could forward to the advisory board and make a motion on that.
Yeah.
I-
What do you think, Director?
Well, I think clearly it's a look before you leap. I mean, I'm not saying that, I mean, there's some things that I believe we could do if, but we got to do it properly. Just like I mentioned, I would really, one of my concerns, and we're moving forward, even looking at a state laboratory, is the possibility of ensuring that we have quality control for products. So that's a big part of it. And I certainly don't like the idea that, people are using product that who knows how it was grown or where it came from. So I understand that piece of it. I understand the idea that we have a new industry in the state. But at the same time, looking at it from a law enforcement perspective, we were hoping to get one of our sessions, testing, saliva testing, and so on and so forth for impaired driving, which we don't have yet. So law enforcement needs to keep up. And I'm just concerned here that we may be just getting a little bit ahead of ourselves when we don't even know what will happen with pretty controlled, and both you gentlemen, all of you have mentioned it, what the regs and policies and procedures that we put in all the discussion with the consumption lounges. Let's see how it's going to turn out before we open it up to over 25,000 folks, and here we go, and off to the races type of thing. So I'm just saying, let's start doing it methodically and looking at some controls, because I think we're getting ahead of ourselves from a law enforcement perspective. And certainly Tom and Detective do more hands-on at these events, and because of local law enforcement than state, but they can also see some of the pitfalls that could happen. And that would be my concern with the local security. I remember even talking about security in the consumption lounges. You can't, as a security officer, for example, you shouldn't use or whatever, but yet you're going to go into an area where there's going to be secondhand smoke, et cetera. So there's just a whole lot we don't know yet, and a whole lot that hasn't been played out. That's I guess basically my message to the commission would be make sure we're doing it right. We're doing it right.
And that goes back to what I was talking about is rather than carte blanche allowing anybody that has a sales license to do this, but maybe get the consumption lounge established, and then in your pilot allow those operators to do these events, before you open it up to everybody, which would kind of slow some things down. I think it would slow some of the apprehension that some of us have, that we're just jumping into this thing with both feet. And it would give some comfort that there's going to be some kind of process behind it.
Anything else from Zoom?
Detective Garber here. Like Director Tagliati said, I agree with pretty much everything he said. I think as a board, instead of giving recommendations of, hey, this is what we should do if this does get approved, is whether or not we even oppose it or approve it. And if they do approve it, then come back to the subcommittee for other things that we could put on the regulations for this.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing, I mean, we've had a bunch of discussion today, and I think there's some good suggestions that came out and some good information, some good questions, but I don't know that we're ready to necessarily take a motion and recommend certain things, although I will say hopefully this work has been useful to the advisory commission and to the board at large. And, I think maybe the number one message coming out of this is, let's see how consumption lounges go and sort of go from there. But I think in further discussion, I don't know that we need to do a motion in particular. I mean, we can come back to do that at some point if it becomes necessary, but I think the discussion itself is hopefully useful to those who tasked us to look at this issue. So unless anybody feels strongly otherwise, I think we probably just leave it at that for now. And I guess I'll pause there and ask if that's okay with folks, that we won't take any particular motion or make any particular recommendations. We'll sort of just stand on the discussion that we had today.
That's fine with me.
Okay, so we're going to close agenda item number 5. We did not take specific action, but we made a pretty good record about concerns, things for the board and the advisory commission to think about. So that'll move us to agenda item 6, which is future meeting topics. And I'm going to imagine that one of those future meeting topics would be taking a look at consumption lounges and then, potentially adding to this discussion. Director Tagliati, we have spoken at a previous meeting about at some point doing a meeting on field sobriety testing that may be available for cannabis. I know that technology has maybe not gone as quickly as we'd like, but I think that's still a potential.
With the session coming up, I think we just have to make sure that from local and state law enforcement that we're staying in pace with the industry and what we need to do to protect the folks that are out there just to have a good time and to know what the product is going to be, know that it's a safe product, and know that they're going to get home safe.
Great. So anything else? Any other subcommittee members have ideas for future meeting topics other than looking at lounges, looking at testing? We mentioned the state laboratory once before, but I think we'll probably have to wait to see what happens at the legislative session.
Right. That's a good piece of it. And I talked to Tyler Klimas about it. And, it's not one thing. We're looking at I'm boy with all the details, but we're looking at possibly having a joint facility up in the north and then another facility for the cannabis down here for the testing of the product and so on and so forth. I think Tom Roberts brought up a good point about with the consumption lounges to see that once those folks are educated in how they're going to operate, the do's and the don'ts and the best practices of it, that may help transition into something like this. And how to do it on a larger scale out in the wilderness or wherever you're going to be. I agree with you on the Allegiant. That grass moves, but not the roof.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's cashless facility. Good luck with that. I don't know if, of course, if it involves in what, we should be looking at this committee or not, but the black market and its impact and whether or not the commission has the resources to address it. And you know what I mean? Is that similar to gaming, right? You have a gaming control board, you have these, gaming investigators that are supposed to go after non-licensed gaming. Are we doing enough in this space? And are there examples in other states that are ahead of us on this? Because that was a big complaint from a lot of licensees last session, which is why I brought a bill forward to try to help with that. But maybe that's something we look at, from the black market side.
I'm encouraged with at least the way this was established with the advisory commission and the board, kind of based on gaming, having worked in the gaming industry. We're at the point where I think with collaboration with the industry will take care of its own business, do it properly, and will police itself. Yeah. I think where we have to be concerned, I know with Metro, is what happens on the highways. And about the extensive amount of illegal grow that's still out there. And is that product getting in and so on and so forth. So we both have our concerns, but I think at the end of the day, we can do this right if we just learn the best way to do it. And there's so much we don't know. And information we don't have, like testing, roadside testing for some of these different types of drugs and things like that.
Great, thank you for that. How about on Zoom? Any additional topics you'd like to see discussed at future meetings?
None from me.
None for me either.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll leave it at that for future meetings. I don't yet know when we might have a future meeting. That will be determined, and staff will do a great job, as they always do, to make sure that we figure out a time we can meet and get us ready for that. So I'll close agenda item 6, which is future meeting topics. And that takes us to agenda item number 7, which is our second round of public comment. Anyone here in Las Vegas who'd like to give public comment? Everyone's shaking their head no. And we don't have any public comment on Zoom either. So I will close agenda item 7, which is public comment. And then just before we adjourn, I wanted to thank subcommittee members for taking some time out of your Halloween Nevada Day, real Nevada Day, Monday morning to spend some time with us. And thank you to Mr. Anderson for being here to present the petition. I hope you all have a really, one more. Staff, thank you for everything you did to get us ready for this meeting. We get to show up and just have the meeting, but they do all the work in the background. So I want to say thanks for that and just wish everyone a really safe Nevada Day, a safe Halloween. And we'll see you all soon. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.